What if Amber got pregnant before she and Mark broke up? That single change would completely alter the emotional structure of Mark's early story, because now their relationship isn't just about missed dates, excuses, and teenage frustration. It becomes about responsibility. It becomes about fear. And more than anything, it becomes about timing, because Amber would find out she's pregnant at the exact point in the relationship where she already feels Mark slipping away from her. That's what makes this scenario so brutal, because Amber wouldn't find out during the good part of the relationship. She'd find out during the collapse. She'd find out when Mark is already becoming more distant, more secretive, more unreliable, and more consumed by being invincible. So instead of seeing his behavior as just frustrating, she'd start seeing it as terrifying. Every missed call means more. Every lie means more. Every time he disappears, it stops feeling like a bad boyfriend moment and starts feeling like evidence that she may be completely alone in something life-changing. And that shifts Amber's entire role in the story. In the original relationship, Amber has the power to walk away once she decides she's done being treated like an afterthought. In this version, she still has that strength, but now she's tied to Mark in a way that makes separation emotionally messier, more painful, and much more permanent. She's not just deciding whether she can keep dating him, she's deciding whether Mark Grayson is somebody she can trust with fatherhood. And honestly, at that point in the story, the answer is probably no. Not because Mark is a bad person, not because he wouldn't care, but because early Mark is still trying to live two lives without being fully honest in either of them. He wants Amber to love him, but he doesn't trust her enough to tell her the truth. He wants to be a hero, but he still treats the people closest to him like they'll just have to understand later. A pregnancy would force that contradiction out into the open immediately. Because now the secret identity isn't just damaging a romance, it's poisoning the foundation of a family before it even begins. And that's where this scenario gets really interesting, because Amber finding out she's pregnant would probably force Mark to reveal the truth much earlier than he did originally. He could maybe get away with vague excuses as a boyfriend. He cannot get away with them as the father of her child. That changes everything. If Amber tells them, Mark's first reaction wouldn't be confidence or joy. It would be panic. Real panic. The kind that goes deeper than superhero danger. Because fighting villains is one thing. Being needed every day by a real person in a real relationship with real consequences, that's something Mark is far less prepared for. For all his strength, Mark at that stage is still emotionally immature. He's reactive. He's overwhelmed. He wants to do the right thing, but wanting to do the right thing and actually being capable of it are two very different things. So if Amber tells him she's pregnant before they break up, Mark probably blurts out the truth about being invincible much sooner. Not because he's finally learned some great lesson, because he has no other move left. And that confession would hit Amber in a much more complicated way than people think. On one hand, it would explain everything: the disappearances, the bruises, the inconsistency, the fact that Mark always seemed like he was living inside some crisis he could never talk about. But on the other hand, it would make the betrayal worse, because now Amber wouldn't just be looking back on a confusing relationship. She'd be realizing that while she was stressing, hurting, and trying to understand why she wasn't enough for him, Mark was making the choice every single day to let her remain in the dark. The secret identity explains the behavior, but it doesn't erase the emotional damage. If anything, it sharpens it. Because then the real issue becomes this: if Mark couldn't trust her with the truth when they were together, why should she trust him now that a child is involved? That would be the core of this version of their relationship, not whether they still love each other, whether love is enough to survive broken trust. And Amber, if written honestly, wouldn't suddenly become soft just because Mark has a big explanation. She'd probably be even more conflicted, more emotional, more angry, not less, because the pregnancy raises the stakes of every flaw Mark already had. He doesn't just vanish on dates, he vanishes when she may need him most. He doesn't just lie to protect her, he lies while asking her to build a future around him. That's why this scenario makes Amber a much heavier character. She stops being just the girlfriend who got tired of superhero excuses and becomes one of the only people in Mark's life forced to ask the most adult question possible way too early. Can this person actually build a life with me, or do they only know how to show up when things are already on fire? And then, of course, the worst possible timing kicks in, because this would all be happening right before Nolan's betrayal. That's where the premise becomes devastating. Imagine Amber having barely processed a pregnancy, barely processed Mark being invincible,
barely even decided whether she can stand to look at him the same way again. And then the entire planet finds out Omni-Man is a monster. Now Mark isn't just a lying boyfriend or a terrified almost father. He's the son of the most dangerous man on Earth. And if you're Amber, that changes the fear completely. Because now you're not just worried about whether Mark can be there for a child. You're worried about what world that child is being born into. You're worried about what Mark might become. You're worried about bloodlines, violence, inherited rage, and whether the boy you loved is more like his father than anyone wants to admit. That fear would eat at Mark too. In fact, I think this would make Mark's fear of becoming Nolan much more personal, much earlier. In the normal story, that fear is mostly tied to identity and morality. In this version, it becomes tied to fatherhood. Mark wouldn't just be asking, "Am I like him?" He'd be asking, "What if I pass something down? What if one day my child looks at me the way I look at my dad now?" That would wreck him. And that's why this alternate scenario could actually mature Mark faster than almost anything else. Because being invincible teaches him how to take a hit. Amber being pregnant would force him to learn how to stay. And staying is harder. Staying means answering the phone. Staying means telling the truth before it's convenient. Staying means accepting that you don't get to be emotionally absent just because your other life is hard. A pregnancy would force Mark to confront the parts of himself that heroism lets him avoid. When he's fighting someone, he knows what to do. When Amber is scared, disappointed, or furious, there's no villain to punch, no clean win, just accountability. That's where this becomes one of the best what-if scenarios for his character, because it attacks the exact weakness Mark had at that point in his life. Not courage, but consistency. And it would change Debbie too. Debbie would almost definitely become Amber's biggest support system, especially once Nolan is exposed. Think about how powerful that dynamic would be. Two women tied to the Grayson men, both forced to reckon with the damage that comes from loving someone who keeps enormous truths buried under protection. Debbie would understand Amber in a way Mark never fully could. She'd see the fear, the anger, the humiliation, the loneliness. And after Nolan's betrayal, Debbie would probably be the one trying to make sure this child has some kind of stable emotional ground before Mark even knows how to offer it. That could also create one of the most painful ironies in the story. Amber may trust Debbie before she trusts Mark, and honestly, that would make sense.
As for Eve, this changes her role too, because once Amber's pregnancy is in the picture, Mark and Eve stop being a simple, maybe someday emotional thread. Eve would now represent possibility, a different life, a different emotional connection, maybe even a more natural partnership, but one that Mark can't access without looking like he's abandoning responsibility. So instead of just being a slow burn romance waiting in the wings, Eve becomes part of the emotional guilt of Mark's life. Every moment of connection with her would be overshadowed by the fact that Amber is carrying his child. That makes everything heavier, sadder, and more complicated for everybody involved. And the biggest change of all? Mark and Amber probably do not stay together romantically. That's important. A lot of weaker versions of this premise would turn it into the baby keeps them together. But that's not what would make this good. What would make it good is the opposite. The pregnancy forces them to deal with each other honestly, but honesty doesn't magically repair what was already broken. They might try, they might care deeply about each other, they might even still love each other, but love under pressure reveals things. And what it would reveal here is that Mark and Amber were already cracking before the pregnancy ever happened. The pregnancy wouldn't create those cracks, it would expose how deep they already were. So the real emotional ending to this what if isn't that Mark suddenly becomes the perfect boyfriend and father. It's that he's forced to become more human, more responsible, more honest, more scared, more present. He'd still fail sometimes, he'd still miss things, he'd still be pulled away by the life of Invincible. But now every mistake would cost more than guilt. It would cost trust, it would cost family, it would cost a chance to prove that he is not Omni-Man. Not just in battle, but in the most important way possible, and how he shows up for the people who depend on him. That's why this version of the story works, because what if Amber got pregnant before she and Mark broke up isn't really a question about shock value, it's a question about pressure. What happens when a relationship that was already dying is suddenly given the highest possible stakes? What happens when superhero secrecy crashes into real-world responsibility? What happens when Mark Grayson is forced to grow up before he's ready? The answer is everything gets more painful,
more complicated and way more interesting, because now this isn't just a breakup story. It's the story of two teenagers realizing that love, fear, betrayal, and responsibility can all exist in the same room at the same time. And for Mark, it would be the first time in his life that being strong wouldn't be enough.